Before we go any further, I am deeply grateful you are here with me today on Dad's Ultimate Payback. Tell me in the comments right now, where are you watching from? Drop your city, your state, or your country down below, because I want to know how far this story travels. Every single voice matters in this room. Please note that while this story contains fictional elements for entertainment and educational purposes, the core lesson hidden beneath the surface is one worth keeping close to your heart. My name is Thomas Miller. I spent 40 long years fixing other people's broken pipes, crawling through flooded, freezing basements in the bitter winter winds of Springfield, Massachusetts, and I never once complained about a single aching bone or a single frozen wrench stuck to my palm. Every callus on these hands went toward one singular purpose: putting food on my only son's table and keeping a secure roof over his head. I started in the plumbing trade at 19 straight out of high school, armed with a secondhand toolbox left behind by my own father and an unyielding willingness to crawl into tight, dark spaces most men wouldn't dare touch. My sweet wife, Margaret, used to tell me with a gentle smile that I was the most stubborn man she had ever known. But Margaret passed away when our son, David, was only 8 years old, stolen away by an aggressive pancreatic cancer that didn't even give us time to say a proper goodbye. One season she was packing David's school lunchbox and humming to the kitchen radio, and the next season she was gone. I sat by her hospital bedside through her final agonizing night, holding her fragile hand until it grew completely cold, and then I drove home, made David breakfast, walked him to school, and showed up at my first plumbing job of the day, because I had 2 workers depending on their weekly paychecks, and a mortgage that cared nothing about my grief. I never remarried, because David was my entire reason to keep breathing, and keeping my head down and working hard was the only way I knew how to survive. When he earned a partial scholarship to Ohio State, I sat alone in my work truck and cried tears of pure relief for 10 long minutes before driving home to congratulate him. And when he graduated and landed a corporate job, I helped him pack his sedan and told him to call his old man every single Sunday without fail. He called for a few months, but then he met Jessica Calloway at a high-end corporate mixer in Naples, Florida, and the Sunday calls slowly grew shorter, then less frequent, until they stopped being phone calls entirely and devolved into brief text messages. I constantly lied to myself, whispering that it was normal, that this is simply what happens when your son builds his own prosperous life. 5 years ago, David called me with a strained tone in his voice, explaining that he and Jessica wanted to buy a permanent home in an upscale, gated community in Naples, Florida, citing the immaculate neighborhood for future grandchildren. He never asked me for a single dime directly, but I heard the heavy, desperate hesitation in his throat when he danced around the topic of the massive down payment, and my heart broke because I instantly knew what it meant. I liquidated every single asset I had built over a lifetime of labor. I wiped out my modest personal savings account, cashed out my retirement fund, and took out a high-risk personal loan against the equity of my humble Springfield house. When all the numbers were crunched, I had enough cash to purchase the Florida property completely outright, and I did just that. I wisely kept the official grant deed in my own name because the legal liability of the loan rested entirely on my shoulders, but I allowed David to sign the resident lease, and I hugged him tightly at the closing table, whispering into his ear, "Don't you worry, son, you will always have a secure home no matter what." He hugged me back and told me I was the greatest father in the world. I believed him, because when you love a child unconditionally, you desperately want to believe every word. By the time spring rolled around last year, the severe arthritis in my knees made ignoring the pain impossible. One afternoon, while wrestling with a heavy cast-iron pipe in a damp crawl space, I dropped my wrench and physically could not pull myself back up without assistance from my 22-year-old apprentice, Marcus. My doctor delivered the grim verdict. My joints were deteriorating far faster than expected, and if I kept working at that brutal pace, I would be permanently confined to a wheelchair before turning 70. I filed for early retirement 2 weeks after that humiliating afternoon, trading my tools for a modest monthly pension while my life savings remained permanently locked into David's luxurious Florida home. I wasn't bitter, but as the New England autumn crept into Springfield, a crushing, suffocating loneliness settled deep into my chest. My wonderful neighbor, Mrs. Carol Reyes, used to leave hot containers of homemade soup outside my front door 3 times a week. One crisp afternoon, after she caught me staring blankly down the empty street, she asked the question that had been haunting my restless nights. "You're finally going to pack up that old truck and drive out to see that boy in Florida, aren't you, Thomas?" 3 days later, I loaded my battered suitcase into the truck bed, backed out of my driveway at 5 o'clock in the morning, and pointed my steering wheel south toward the sunshine. By the time I navigated my old truck onto the pristine streets of the exclusive gated community in Naples, on a warm Tuesday evening, the golden autumn sun was sinking low. I killed the engine, climbed out with my knees throbbing, walked up the immaculate stone walkway, and pressed the polished doorbell. A few moments later, the heavy oak door swung open, and my son looked at me not with warm affection, but with the cold, irritated expression of a man staring down an unexpected, financially threatening bill. "Dad," David muttered. Before I could open my arms, his wife Jessica appeared behind him in a pristine silk blouse, her face freezing into a mask of pure disdain. "Thomas," she cooed in a voice dripping with synthetic politeness. "We certainly weren't expecting a vulgar, unannounced visitor today." I held out a small bag of regional maple candies I had bought hours earlier. Jessica reached out with 2 manicured fingers, took the bag and tossed it onto the kitchen counter without glancing at its direction, before instructing David to throw me into the dark guest room at the far end of the service hallway. That night, sitting on the edge of a bed that felt entirely foreign, I tried to convince myself that people simply needed time to adjust. But by the 4th day, any lingering illusions were brutally shattered. I walked out of the guest room to find my worn leather suitcase packed tight, zipped completely shut, and placed coldly out in the public hallway alongside my toiletry bag, neatly lined up like abandoned luggage waiting outside a cheap motel checkout counter. My throat constricted, the crushing realization hitting me that someone had invaded my private space and systematically evicted my belongings. Just as I stood there paralyzed, Jessica's sharp, unforgiving voice pierced through the master bedroom wall, followed closely by the calculating words of her wealthy real estate mogul father, Gerald Calloway, who had arrived earlier. "The sooner you throw that old, broken beggar out on the street, the better off our family name will be." The next morning, the formal courtroom execution took place in the living room. David stood silently with his back pressed flat against the wall, his arms tightly crossed, completely cowardly and entirely unable to meet my gaze. Jessica stepped forward, looking me up and down with the absolute contempt one reserves for a stray animal, and snapped, "There is simply no room in this luxury house for an old man who does nothing all day but whine about his aching back and broken knees. You retired with absolutely nothing in your pockets. Have some basic self-awareness and find somewhere else to crawl off and die. All you do here is take up expensive space and breathe air that costs our family hard-earned money." Before I could find a single coherent word, Jessica's mother, Diane, chimed in with a smile wrapped like a razor blade in silk. "A lifetime of crawling around in muddy plumbing ditches with filthy, calloused hands, and you actually think that makes you the patriarch of this family? Look at yourself standing next to a magnificent home like this. You are a complete embarrassment to us all. Pick up that cheap suitcase right now and get out." I didn't argue. I turned around on legs that felt like hollow glass, walked down the hall, picked up my heavy suitcase, and carried it straight to the front door. Jessica eagerly pulled the heavy door open, shoved my bag across the marble threshold with her own foot, watched it tip sideways and tumble violently down the front steps, striking the concrete pavement with a loud, echoing crash. Not stopping at that, Jessica whipped out her smartphone and dialed her wealthy parents on speakerphone, her voice loud and carrying proudly across the quiet gated neighborhood. "Mom, Dad, you have to drive over right now and see this. We are finally tossing this dirty, broke-down plumber right out of our elite community before he devalues our property values," she shrieked with venomous satisfaction. Through it all, David stood 10 feet away, staring down fixedly at his expensive Italian loafers, refusing to open his mouth to utter a single syllable of defense for his own father. I walked down those stairs in the gray morning light, my aging hands trembling so violently I could barely zip my bag back together. Standing alone at the bottom of that pristine path with 60 years of hard-earned working-class dignity and absolutely nowhere left in the world to put it, driven by a mixture of shock and sheer survival instinct, I drove 2 hours north to Tampa, Florida, a working-class city where my pension could stretch just enough to keep me alive. I found shelter in a modest, sun-faded stucco apartment complex tucked away on the quiet outskirts of Tampa. Room 4B was small, barely 12 feet wide, featuring a single lumpy bed covered by a blue quilt, a squeaking miniature refrigerator, and a small window looking out over a bustling corner street. It wasn't much, but it was safe. My meager monthly pension from 40 years of plumbing work barely stretched to cover the rent and basic groceries, forcing me to swallow my remaining pride and look for odd jobs just to keep my head above water. That was when the universe, in its own quiet way, sent me a lifeline. My immediate neighbor in room 4A was a wonderful, sturdy woman named Carol Reyes, a retired clinic worker with deep laugh lines etched around her eyes who made it her personal mission to feed me heavy bowls of homemade chicken pozole 3 times a week. Through Carol's warm community, I was introduced to Ray Dominguez, a kind-hearted man in his mid-50s who owned the narrow, packed little corner grocery store down the street. Ray had a hand-painted sign above his register reading, We don't have everything, but we have what you need. When Ray found out I had spent a lifetime working with my hands, he immediately brought me to his back storage room to fix a notoriously rattling pipe. I had it sealed and quieted in under 40 minutes. Impressed by my swift, master-level craftsmanship, Ray started sliding my name and phone number to his regular customers, and within a few short weeks, I had a steady stream of small repair gigs across Tampa, slow drains, stubborn pressure valves, and sputtering gas lines. Working with my tools kept the dark, bitter thoughts at bay, grounding me in the rhythmic familiarity of honest labor. Then, roughly a month after my humiliating exile from Florida, an emergency dispatch order crossed Ray's desk from a property management company handling service calls in upscale regions, including the gated community in Naples. A client had reported a severe, sudden leak under a kitchen sink alongside a precarious, sputtering gas fitting behind the stove, a complex configuration that 2 other commercial contractors had flatly refused to touch. Ray handed me the address and work order without checking the street name too closely, but the moment my eyes scanned the bold lettering on the paper, my breath caught violently in my throat. It was Elmwood Drive. It was the exact luxury house I had purchased with every single penny of my life savings, the very home from which I had been dragged and thrown out like broken trash just weeks prior. A cold, steely wave of adrenaline surged through my veins, pushing aside the aching pain in my knees. I didn't hesitate. I packed my canvas utility belt, pulled my worn gray work cap low over my forehead, let my gray, unkempt stubble grow out thick, and drove my battered old truck back down to Florida. When I pulled into the pristine driveway of the Elmwood Drive property, David's car was thankfully absent, meaning I wouldn't have to face my cowardly son just yet. But Jessica was home. She answered the front door with her smartphone permanently glued to her ear, her face twisted in an expression of intense, multitasking corporate annoyance. She didn't even bother to look up or make eye contact with the tradesman standing on her doorstep. She merely waved her free hand impatiently, pointed a manicured finger toward the kitchen, and barked into her phone. "The plumber's finally here." I told them it only took 3 calls to get someone halfway competent. Without uttering a single syllable, I ducked my head, walked into the magnificent kitchen I had paid for with 4 decades of sweat, and slid my heavy toolbox onto the polished tile floor. Jessica treated me with the absolute casual cruelty one reserves for a common domestic servant. As I knelt down on the hard tile to inspect the warped, water-damaged wooden base beneath the kitchen sink, she walked past me twice, completely ignoring my existence while discussing upscale weekend brunch plans. At one point, she casually dropped an empty sparkling water bottle onto the floor just a few inches from my boots, snapping, "Clean that up if it's in your way, and make sure you don't track any of your filthy outdoor dirt onto my designer rugs." I kept my jaw clamped shut so hard my teeth ached, swallowing the bitter, burning humiliation rising in my throat. I was an invisible ghost in my own house, subjected to the casual, dehumanizing tyranny of a woman who believed her wealth made her entirely bulletproof. Working systematically, I began replacing the faulty compression sleeve and reseating the fragile gas line behind the stove, moving with the meticulous, unhurried precision of a master craftsman who knew every safety hazard in the book. As I reached deep into the far corner of the dark lower cabinet to check the cold water supply line, my right forearm brushed sharply against the interior wooden paneling. Something unusual snagged the fabric of my work jacket. Frowning, I pulled a flashlight from my belt and angled the beam directly into the shadowed recess of the cabinet. My breath hitched, and my heart violently slammed against my ribs. Taped securely to the inside panel of the kitchen cabinet, completely hidden from casual view yet preserved carefully beneath a strip of yellowed, aging masking tape, was a faded family photograph. I reached out with a trembling, calloused finger and gently touched the edge of the picture. It was a snapshot of us from a lifetime ago. Margaret smiling brightly into the summer sun, a little 7-year-old David grinning with a gap-toothed laugh, and a much younger, thinner version of myself standing proudly with my arm wrapped securely around both of them outside our old house in Springfield. Staring at that hidden photograph, a suffocating mixture of sorrow and burning clarity flooded my chest. David hadn't thrown it away. He had brought this memento all the way down to Florida, furnishing his opulent Florida life with expensive catalog items. Yet he had secretly taped the sole remaining proof of his true origins inside a dark kitchen cabinet where no casual visitor, and certainly never Jessica, would ever lay eyes on it. It was a silent, pathetic confession. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that beneath all the layers of corporate greed, snobbery, and moral cowardice, my son still remembered who he was and where he came from. He still held a fragile ember of love for the father who had raised him, but he had willingly extinguished it, selling out his own soul and erasing his heritage for the shallow illusion of wealth and the suffocating comfort of his grasping wife's family. As I carefully closed the cabinet door and stood back up on my aching legs, clutching my wrench tightly in my fist, I realized the full, tragic scope of the trap my son had built for himself. He was a prisoner in a gilded cage of his own making, terrified of losing the luxury he hadn't actually earned. I finished tightening the final pipe fitting, packed my tools into my canvas bag, and looked at Jessica one last time as she stood by the island scrolling through her tablet. "Done," I said, keeping my voice flat, low, and completely devoid of emotion. She didn't look up, merely transferring the service fee to the contractor account Ray had set up and waving a dismissive hand. About time. I turned on my heel, walked out the front door, and climbed back into my truck. The secret photograph was now burned into my memory, signaling that the final, quiet reckoning was rapidly approaching, and they had no idea what was coming for them. The drive back to Tampa felt heavy, as if every mile of asphalt was actively pressing down on the raw, open wounds my son and his wife had inflicted upon my soul. By the time I pulled my battered truck back into the sun-faded parking lot in Tampa, my knees were throbbing with a relentless stabbing agony, and my mind was clouded by a profound, suffocating weariness. I dragged myself up the outdoor metal staircase, unlocked the door to room 4B, and collapsed onto the edge of the lumpy bed, letting the quiet, unpretentious familiarity of the small room wrap around me like a worn-out blanket. I had spent 40 years breaking my back in freezing basements, yet nothing I had ever endured physically could compare to the chilling hollowness of standing in a multi-million-dollar home, only to be treated like human debris by my own flesh and blood. Needing an escape from the oppressive weight of my own thoughts, I forced my aching legs back up and walked down the block to the narrow, tightly packed little corner store run by Ray Dominguez. The bell above the door chimed with a cheerful, hollow ring as I pushed my way inside, heading straight for the small cooler in search of a cold bottle of water. When I placed the water and a package of basic crackers on the wooden counter, Ray squinted over his reading glasses, took my cash, and immediately frowned as he fumbled through his register drawer. "I am coming up short on my singles tonight, Thomas," Ray muttered with an apologetic chuckle, running a hand through his graying hair. "I don't have enough small bills to give you your exact change back. Tell you what, let me slide a Powerball ticket into your hand to even out the dollar amount. The jackpot has rolled over for 11 straight weeks and is sitting at an astronomical number right now. Who knows, maybe your luck is about to change." I looked down at the small, crisp slip of paper he slid across the counter toward me. In my 68 years of hard-working life, I had never purchased a single lottery ticket, viewing them as a foolish tax on people who refuse to accept the honest reality of a hard day's labor. But looking into Ray's kind, weathered eyes, I didn't have the heart to refuse his gesture. "Sure, Ray. Why not?" I murmured with a faint, tired smile, taking the slip and sliding it securely into the front pocket of my worn canvas work shirt. That evening, sitting alone at the small wooden desk in my room under the dim, buzzing glow of a single desk lamp, I pulled the Powerball slip out and stared at it for a long, quiet moment. With a wooden pencil from the cup, I slowly and deliberately filled in the 5 numbers using the milestone dates of my life. Margaret's birthday, the day we were married, and David's birth date, not out of any desperate, delusional hope of winning a fortune, but simply as a quiet, private ritual of remembrance for a life that had slipped through my fingers. I tossed the ticket onto the corner of the desk, completely dismissing it from my mind, knowing full well that hard work and heartbreak were the only constants I could ever truly count on. Just as a heavy wave of isolation threatened to drag me back down into the dark abyss of self-pity, a gentle, familiar knock rapped against my door. I opened it to find Carol Reyes standing in the hallway, holding a steaming, heavy ceramic pot with both hands, her face creased with that deep, empathetic warmth that always managed to anchor me back to reality. "Sit down at that table right now, Thomas," Carol commanded playfully, her voice filled with an unyielding maternal authority. "I made a massive batch of chicken pozole, and my daughter always tells me my biggest character flaw is that I cook enough food to feed an entire battalion. You look like a ghost who hasn't seen a proper meal in 3 days, so you are going to help me solve my problem." We sat at my tiny kitchen table for over an hour, sharing bowls of rich red broth soup laden with shredded meat, hominy, and fresh lime. Carol didn't pry or push me to talk about my disastrous trip to Florida. Instead, she talked easily and naturally about the vibrant life of the neighborhood, about the local tamale vendor who set up his cart every Friday evening, about the family on the second floor who kept a surprisingly loud rooster, and about her own daughter who called her every single Sunday from Phoenix. Sitting there across from her in that 12 by 15-foot room, listening to the hum of the miniature refrigerator and feeling the nourishing heat of the soup settle deep into my chest, I experienced a rare, profound sense of peace. It was a quiet, unassuming warmth rooted entirely in the genuine kindness of the working class, standing in stark, beautiful contrast to the sterile, heartless luxury of the multi-million-dollar mansion where my own son had treated me like a discarded piece of trash. Yet, while I was finding a fragile sanctuary in the humble streets of Tampa, a digital firestorm was quietly igniting across the internet, completely unbeknownst to me. Unknown to anyone in our quiet corner of the city, a middle-aged woman living right next door to David and Jessica in that exclusive gated community in Naples had been standing at her second-floor bedroom window on the exact morning of my brutal eviction. Holding her smartphone up with a mixture of shock and utter disbelief, that neighbor had covertly filmed the entire harrowing scene, capturing every agonizing detail of Jessica shoving my worn leather suitcase across the pristine marble threshold, watching it tip sideways, and tumbling violently down the front steps onto the concrete below, while I stood there with trembling hands trying to zip my spilled toiletry bag back together. That very afternoon, the neighbor had uploaded the raw, unedited video footage to a popular local community page with a scathing caption calling out the heartless mistreatment of an elderly father by his wealthy, entitled children. Within 48 hours, the digital algorithm had weaponized the footage, catapulting the video across multiple mainstream platforms including Reddit, X, and Facebook, where it rapidly went viral with millions of views and shares. A regional news outlet in Florida picked up the story, broadcasting the heartbreaking clip under a searing headline investigating the ruthless callousness of privileged suburban families abandoning their aging parents. Across the nation, an overwhelming wave of public fury began to swell. Thousands of outraged internet sleuths and local commentators flooded social media threads with bitter condemnation, aggressively trying to track down and identify the cruel couple featured in the video, digging up public property records and corporate listings tied to the Elmwood Drive address. An underground network of righteous indignation was rapidly organizing, digging deep into the lives of David and Jessica, completely unaware that the broken, gray-haired old man who had walked away from those steps with his head held high was currently sitting in a tiny, sun-faded room in Tampa, quietly eating a bowl of soup, totally oblivious to the fact that a massive, unstoppable storm of public accountability was brewing just over the horizon, waiting to tear their pampered world apart. The morning sun cut sharply through the small, unwashed window of room 4B, casting a pale, dusty beam across the lumpy blue bedspread where I sat in quiet isolation. The air inside the cramped space carried the faint, familiar scent of old wood and the distant hum of traffic pulsing up from the bustling streets of Tampa. It was a Thursday morning that felt entirely indistinguishable from the dozen quiet mornings that had preceded it. A solemn rhythm defined by aching knees, the quiet memory of Margaret's gentle smile, and the honest, calloused hands that still knew how to fix the broken machinery of the world. I had just finished brewing a cup of instant coffee, using the small hot plate on my wooden desk, when my old smartphone buzzed against the surface, vibrating with a sharp, insistent chatter that broke the morning silence. I glanced down at the screen, expecting another automated notification or perhaps a friendly text message from Carol checking in about breakfast. Instead, it was an alert notification from a national news application I had downloaded weeks earlier, flashing a breaking financial update about the massive multi-state lottery jackpot that had dominated the airwaves, acting on a sudden, unexplainable impulse. A quiet voice whispering in the back of my mind. I unlocked the phone, navigated to the official Florida lottery results page, and pulled the crumpled slip of paper Ray Dominguez had slid across his grocery counter out of my work shirt pocket. My eyes moved slowly, deliberately, matching the numbers printed on the screen one by one with the handwritten milestone dates I had scrawled down in pen days ago. Margaret's birthday. The year I first picked up my father's heavy pipe wrench. David's birth date. The screen refreshed, highlighting every single digit in a brilliant glowing green frame. I stopped breathing entirely. My heart slammed against my ribs with the force of a sledgehammer, sending a sudden, rushing wave of heat straight to my throat. I stared at the numbers, blinked hard, wiped my glasses, and read them again. Then a third time. The jackpot that had rolled over for 11 consecutive weeks had finally found a single winning ticket sold in Florida. $1 billion. The lump sum cash option after federal and state taxes would clear out at just over $600 million, a number so astronomical, so completely detached from the reality of a working-class plumber who had spent 40 years crawling through freezing basements, that it had no physical shape I could possibly hold in my mind. The tiny room seemed to tilt slightly on its axis, the humming miniature refrigerator sounding like a distant waterfall. I sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, pressing both palms flat against my knees to stop them from trembling violently, struggling to process a reality that had just upended the entire universe in a matter of seconds. Before I could even begin to process the crushing weight of that $600 million reality, my phone buzzed aggressively in my hand once more. This time, it wasn't a lottery notification. The caller ID displayed an incoming call from a Florida area code, tagged with the name of Linda Holt, a premier real estate and property litigation attorney based in Florida. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear, my voice coming out rough and breathless. "Mr. Thomas Miller?" A sharp, highly professional yet urgently concerned female voice cut through the line. "My name is Linda Holt. I've been trying to track you down through public records and local contacts for nearly 24 hours. We need to speak immediately regarding the residential property on Elmwood Drive in Naples, Florida. Something illegal, calculated, and deeply damaging is happening with that estate right under your nose, and you need to know about it right now." The mention of the Elmwood Drive house, the very home I had purchased with every single penny of my life savings, only to be physically thrown off its front steps like garbage by my ungrateful son, snapped my racing mind back to sharp, razor-sharp focus. I pushed the lottery numbers to the back of my consciousness, pulled myself upright, and told her to meet me as soon as possible. Later that afternoon, sitting across a polished glass conference table in Linda Holt's office overlooking the city, the full, horrifying scope of my son's moral and legal corruption was laid bare before my eyes. Linda slid a thick, white-tabbed legal folder across the wooden surface, adjusting her reading glasses as she opened the first set of certified documents. "Mr. Miller, let's establish the foundational facts first," Linda began, her tone clipping, precise and laced with suppressed indignation. "Your name is the sole legal name listed on the original grant deed for the Elmwood Drive property, recorded with the county clerk 5 years ago when the purchase was executed. You funded the acquisition entirely, and you carry the legal liability. That makes you the undisputed, sole legal owner of record." "I know that," I replied quietly, my jaw tightening. "I bought it for my son so he would always have a secure roof over his head." "Your son apparently believed he could erase that little detail through bureaucratic fraud," Linda countered sharply, sliding a second set of documents across the table. 3 weeks ago, right around the exact time your medical retirement was finalized, David and his wife Jessica filed a preliminary change of ownership report, commonly known as a P-Corp, with the Collier County Assessor's Office. On this official government document, they formally claimed that you had voluntarily transferred full, unencumbered real property ownership directly to them. A cold, razor-thin shiver raced down my spine, freezing the blood in my veins. "I never signed any transfer deed," I said, my voice dropping an octave into a low, dangerous rumble. "I never authorized a change of ownership, and I certainly never visited a notary public." "That is precisely the smoking gun," Linda stated, tapping her pen against the fraudulent filing. "To legally transfer real estate title in this state, Florida law mandates an executed, notarized grant deed signed directly by the property owner in front of a licensed official. They filed the P-Corp to trigger the tax assessor's database update, but they omitted the notarized deed because they knew you would never sign it away. But it gets much worse, Mr. Miller. My preliminary title investigation into local county filings revealed something far more sinister than a simple family dispute over housing." Linda leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine with grave, professional intensity. "This wasn't just a clumsy oversight or an impatient misunderstanding by young people eager to play house. Based on my review of the timeline and supplementary property listings, David and Jessica have been actively coordinating with a high-end commercial real estate broker in Naples to list the Elmwood Drive property for an immediate, below-market cash sale. They were systematically conspiring to execute a fraudulent title transfer, sell the multi-million-dollar house out from under you, and completely liquidate your entire lifetime investment into liquid cash. They were deliberately planning to pocket the multi-million-dollar proceeds, divide the cash spoils with Jessica's wealthy real estate mogul parents, and permanently disappear before you ever recovered from your knee surgeries or realized what they had done. The suffocating silence of the law office pressed down on my chest like a physical weight. The bitter, toxic reality washed over me in blinding clarity. David wasn't just emotionally bankrupt. He was a criminal in the making, guided by the greedy, predatory instincts of his wife's family, willing to commit calculated financial sabotage and felony fraud against his own aging father just to pad his luxury lifestyle. Filing a false ownership claim and submitting fraudulent instruments to a government office to alter real estate records is not a civil infraction, Mr. Miller, Linda concluded grimly, watching my face for a reaction. Under Florida statutes, Section 817.535, filing a false instrument is a serious felony. It carries mandatory state prison time. They didn't just break your heart, Thomas. They walked straight across a legal line that could land both of them behind iron bars. Sitting there in that quiet law office, holding the paperwork that proved my son had plotted to steal my life savings and throw me into the streets forever, The $600 million Powerball ticket resting in my shirt pocket suddenly felt less like a stroke of blind luck and more like a divine instrument of absolute, unbending justice. The trap was fully set, the web of lies was fully exposed, and my son was about to learn that when you try to bury a working-class man who spent 40 years mastering the hidden depths of broken systems, you better make sure the ground you bury him in is deep enough to hold a titan. The warm, golden afternoon sun bathed the sprawling, immaculate back patio of the Elmwood Drive estate in a rich, luxurious glow, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and the sparkling turquoise surface of the custom swimming pool. It was a picturesque Saturday in Naples, Florida, designed explicitly for the kind of effortless, high-society leisure that defined the upper echelons of local real estate royalty. David and Jessica were hosting an exclusive outdoor celebration, a lavish weekend barbecue ostensibly thrown to toast their glittering social standing, but beneath the veneer of clinking crystal champagne flutes and laughter, it was a thinly veiled victory party. They were celebrating the final, successful execution of what they smugly considered to be the masterstroke of their domestic life, ridding themselves of the permanent, annoying encumbrance of a broken, impoverished, aging father whose working-class existence had long been viewed as an embarrassing stain on their pristine corporate image. The guest list was small, intimate, and fiercely selective, consisting entirely of Jessica's wealthy parents, Gerald and Diane Calloway, alongside a couple of elite business associates who spoke in hushed, reverent tones about multi-million-dollar commercial developments and offshore tax shelters. Gerald Calloway lounged comfortably in a designer teakwood patio chair, wearing a crisp linen shirt and holding a tumbler of aged scotch, looking every bit the ruthless real estate mogul who took immense pride in crushing competitors. Diane sat beside him, adorned in expensive diamond tennis bracelets, delicately picking at a gourmet appetizer while discussing the sophisticated nuances of private country club memberships. David stood near the outdoor stainless steel kitchen island, flipping thick cuts of prime ribeye steak on the grill, a cocktail in one hand and a relaxed, relieved smile plastered across his face. The lingering guilt that had briefly shadowed his eyes the day I was thrown off the porch had long since evaporated, burned away by the soothing balm of absolute financial security and his wife's constant, reassuring validation that they had simply done what was necessary for the family's future. Jessica floated through the gathering with the practiced grace of a socialite who believed the world revolved exclusively around her whims. She wore a stunning white designer sundress, her manicured fingers wrapped securely around a crystal glass filled to the brim with expensive Chardonnay. She paused near the edge of the sprawling stone patio where a sleek, flat-screen outdoor television was mounted beneath the shaded white pergola, broadcasting a live, mid-afternoon regional news and entertainment broadcast for background noise. As the sizzling sound of steaks on the grill mingled with the soft, ambient jazz music playing from the patio speakers, Jessica caught sight of a trending viral segment flashing across the lower news ticker of the screen, prompting her to let out a sharp, amused laugh that instantly drew the attention of her parents and husband. "Darling, you have to look at this. It's absolutely priceless," Jessica called out, her voice dripping with sharp, malicious mockery as she pointed a manicured finger directly at the television monitor. "They're still replaying that ridiculous viral video on the local news feeds. The one where that dramatic neighbor filmed us tossing the old man's cheap, battered suitcase out onto the front steps a few weeks ago." Gerald Calloway chuckled darkly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass without looking up from his lawn chair. "People on the internet love manufacturing outrage over nothing, Jess. They don't understand the realities of high-end property management. A man who spends 40 years crawling through sewage ditches has no business expecting a luxury retirement inside a gated community." "Exactly, Daddy," Jessica chimed in, taking a slow, triumphant sip of her Chardonnay, her eyes glittering with unbridled malice as she watched a frozen still frame of my bent, gray-haired figure, holding a battered zipper bag, flash briefly across the screen. "Look at him standing out there on the curb, looking completely pathetic. The poor, delusional old fool is probably roaming the gritty streets of some dirty industrial town right now, freezing, begging for loose change, and digging through dumpsters just to afford a cheap cup of gas station coffee. Good riddance, I say. Some people are simply born to be common laborers, and no amount of family charity can ever polish a piece of cheap scrap metal into gold." David paused his work at the grill for a fraction of a second, a fleeting shadow crossing his features at the sound of his wife mocking his father so viciously in front of her parents. But Gerald let out an approving, barking laugh, and Diane nodded in cold agreement, murmuring something about maintaining strict neighborhood standards. Eager to earn the total, unconditional approval of his wealthy in-laws, David quickly swallowed his momentary hesitation, forced a weak, complicit smile back onto his face, and turned his attention back to flipping the steaks. silently burying whatever lingering shreds of filial conscience he had managed to smuggle across the country. "Well, let's drink a toast to that," Gerald announced loudly, raising his glass toward the sky with a triumphant grin. "To shedding dead weight and securing our rightful place at the top. Cheers to absolute freedom." As the four adults clicked their glasses together in a joyful, self-congratulatory salute to their own unmitigated cruelty, completely lost in the intoxicating fumes of their arrogance, none of them noticed that the outdoor television broadcast had abruptly cut away from its scheduled lifestyle segment. The studio anchor's voice shifted from casual banter to a tone of electric, high-stakes excitement, announcing that the historic, multi-state Powerball lottery drawings had officially concluded, and the verified winner of the staggering, record-breaking $1 billion jackpot was about to step out onto the live national television stage to claim the historic check. Right at the exact microsecond Jessica raised her wine glass to take another triumphant sip, the camera angle on the patio television instantly shifted from the local newsroom straight to the brightly lit, star-studded television broadcast stage in Los Angeles. The towering graphic on the screen exploded in brilliant flashing gold letters, $1 billion winner verify. The studio audience erupted into a deafening roar of applause, and the camera steadily panned across the stage, directly zooming in on the tall, dignified figure of a 68-year-old man standing tall and proud in a freshly tailored navy blue suit, his shoulders squared and his hands resting calmly at his sides. The wind on the Naples patio suddenly felt entirely frozen. Jessica's raised wine glass stopped halfway to her lips, her fingers instantly locking into a paralyzed grip. The smug, venomous smile froze on her face, slowly fracturing into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Gerald's glass slipped an inch from his fingers, and David dropped his grilling spatula with a loud, ringing clatter against the concrete patio floor. The man standing on that national television screen, the man who had just conquered the financial universe with a single stroke of luck, wasn't a stranger. It was Thomas Miller. It was the old, broken plumber they had just mocked, degraded, and physically thrown out onto the street like worthless garbage less than a month ago. The television studio was a surreal, high-voltage arena of blinding stage lights and expectant silence, the kind of atmosphere that hums with the collective breath of millions of viewers watching from across the nation. I stood in the wings, draped in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, the first piece of high-end clothing I had ever owned in my 68 years. As the floor manager counted down from 10, a profound, crystal-clear serenity washed over me. I wasn't the broken, shivering man standing on that cold Florida sidewalk anymore. I was a man who had finally reclaimed the dignity that was rightfully his. When the bright red on-air light flickered to life and the studio audience erupted into a deafening, thunderous ovation, I walked onto the center stage with a steady, deliberate stride. The lottery official, wearing a crisp uniform and an expression of genuine awe, lifted the ceremonial oversized check that spanned the width of the stage. The bold black ink clearly displayed a number with 9 zeros, and beneath it in elegant, unwavering typeface was the name Thomas Miller. I shook the official's hand, took the check, and turned to face the primary camera, my expression calm and composed, a quiet anchor in the storm of flashbulbs. I didn't smile like a man who had won a game of chance. I stood like a man who had finally seen the scales of justice balance after a lifetime of labor. 4 miles away, back at the Elmwood Drive estate in Naples, the atmosphere of the Victory Barbecue had curdled into something wretched and suffocating. The air, once filled with the clinking of expensive crystal and the smug laughter of people who believed they had made it, was now frozen in a state of absolute paralyzed shock. Jessica's Chardonnay glass had slipped from her numb fingers, shattering against the stone patio and splashing wine across her designer sandals, but she didn't even flinch. Gerald Calloway sat motionless, his tumbler of scotch held mid-air, his eyes locked onto the screen with the hollow, haunting gaze of a man watching his entire empire collapse in real time. Diane, the woman who had only hours ago sneered at my filthy, calloused hands, was now clutching her own throat, her face drained of all color, her diamond bracelets catching the light as her hand trembled uncontrollably. David, my son, was the most pathetic sight of all. He had dropped his grilling spatula, and it lay forgotten on the grass, a smear of grease staining his expensive linen shirt. He was staring at the screen as if his very reality had been torn asunder, his mouth slightly ajar, his breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He couldn't process the visual information, the suit, the poise, the sheer, undeniable reality of his father standing there as a global icon of success. He had spent his entire life learning how to exploit people, how to project power, and how to discard those he deemed useless. And yet here was the man he had thrown into the gutter, now untouchable and standing on the summit of the world. Then the primal instinct of the desperate took hold of him. David's hand darted into his pocket, his fingers fumbling in a frantic, uncoordinated rush until he pulled out his phone. He didn't think about the humiliation or the cameras. He only thought about the money, the house, and the terrifying realization that his life was no longer his own. He pressed the call button with a shaking thumb, staring at the TV screen as if he could manifest a connection through the glass. Back on the studio stage, the massive screens surrounding the set were displaying a live feed of the global ticker. My personal phone, resting securely in the breast pocket of my suit, began to vibrate with a persistent, desperate ring. I glanced down at the ID David. The studio audience suddenly quieted, a murmur of confusion rippling through the rows of people. The camera zoomed in, picking up the call notification. I didn't flinch, I didn't turn away. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the phone, and with a slow, deliberate motion that the entire world watched in breathless anticipation, I pressed answer and put the phone on speaker, holding it directly up to the microphone attached to my lapel. "Dad?" David's voice crackled through the stage monitors, sounding high-pitched, cracked, and utterly broken. "Dad, I just saw you. I saw you on the news. I don't even know what to say. I'm sorry. Please, Dad, you have to come home. We'll take care of you, I swear. Everything will be different. Just please, stop this." I didn't let him finish his script of hollow apologies. I stood perfectly still, looking directly into the camera lens, my voice steady, resonant, and cold enough to shatter glass. "David," I said, my voice carrying into the homes of millions, "I'm looking at the screen right now. I see the yard, I see the patio, and I see the people you're hiding behind. Tell me, the house in Naples you're currently standing in, the one you tried to steal from me, have you paid this month's rent yet? Or are you calling because you've already figured out that you can't afford it without the father you threw out like trash?" The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and agonizing. David made a choking sound, a desperate, gargantuan gulp of air, but no words came out. I didn't wait for him to find his footing. "Don't bother calling again, David. You don't have a father anymore. You only have a landlord who's about to evict you." I tapped the end call button with a precise final click. I didn't look at the camera with anger. I looked at it with the calm, terrifying indifference of a man who has finally paid his dues and collected his change. I tucked the phone back into my pocket, straightened my navy blue jacket, and looked at the lottery official. The entire world was watching, but for the first time in 40 years, I felt completely, unshakably free. I had survived the freezing basements, the cancer wards, and the betrayal of my own flesh and blood. Now, it was their turn to freeze. And just like I had promised Margaret all those years ago, I had finally come home, not as a victim, but as a man who owned the house, the land, and the future. I stood tall, kept my spirit unbreakable, and remembered the golden rule of Dad's ultimate payback. You never truly know a person's worth until you take away their safety net. And today, David had finally fallen into the dark, silent abyss he had prepared for me. The golden Sunday morning in Naples, Florida, arrived with a deceptive, calm beauty that stood in stark contrast to the wreckage currently unfolding inside the Elmwood Drive estate. I arrived at the front gate at 8:43 a.m., accompanied by Linda Holt, my legal counsel. She walked with a steady, clinical precision, carrying a leather portfolio that contained not just legal papers but the final, undeniable death warrant for my son's stolen lifestyle. As we approached the massive double doors, I felt no surge of triumph, no adrenaline-fueled joy, only a profound, hollow sense of finality. This was the house I had spent 40 years of freezing, back-breaking labor to secure. It was the house I had bought with my own life's blood, and today I was here to reclaim my dignity. David opened the door, and for a fleeting, sickening moment, he looked like the boy I had raised alone, the gap-toothed child who used to hide behind my legs when he was scared of the dark. Now, he was a hollowed-out man, unshaven and trembling, his face a ghostly mask of someone who hadn't slept a wink since he saw his father standing on the national stage. When he looked up and saw me, the color drained from his skin so violently that he nearly collapsed against the entryway. "Dad," he croaked, his voice cracking like dry kindling. "Please, just listen to me. I can explain everything. I was weak, I was wrong. Please," and I didn't let him finish. I simply stepped past him into the foyer, my heavy work boots echoing against the marble like a gavel strike. Inside, the living room was a scene of total wreckage. Gerald and Diane Calloway, once so arrogant and poised, looked like scavengers caught in a trap. Gerald stood by the fireplace, his chest deflated, his signature swagger utterly vanquished. He was merely an old man who had bet his daughter's future on a fraudulent scheme. Jessica hovered near the hallway entrance, her arms wrapped around herself, her face stripped of every layer of practiced composure she had spent years constructing. Linda Holt didn't waste a single syllable. She placed her portfolio on the polished coffee table and opened it with the clinical efficiency of a surgeon. "Grant deed," she said, her voice sharp and unrelenting, "recorded with Collier County records 5 years ago. Thomas Miller, sole owner. Lease agreement, David Miller, tenant. And here," she added, sliding the final document onto the pile, "is the report your son and his wife filed 3 weeks ago claiming a voluntary transfer of ownership without a notarized deed. Filing a false instrument with a government office is a felony under Florida statutes, Section 817535, Mr. Calloway. We have the proof, we have the intent, and we have the notification of eviction based on severe lease violations and fraudulent activity. Gerald's face turned a mottled, sickly shade of gray as he sank into the sofa. David, meanwhile, had dropped to his knees on the cold tile, pressing his face into his palms, his shoulders racking with heavy, uncontrollable sobs. It wasn't the sound of a man mourning his father's loss. It was the raw, jagged sound of a man mourning his own unearned comfort. I looked down at him, this boy I had carried alone through 30 years of winters, and I felt a cold, river-like grief wash through me. I didn't reach for him. I didn't offer a hand to lift him up. When I had been thrown off this very porch weeks ago, there was no one to reach for me. "David," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and utterly devoid of mercy. "What did you do? You sold your own blood for a house you didn't pay for and a name that wasn't yours. You thought that because I was a plumber, I was something you could just discard and replace." He had no answer. He only sobbed harder, a broken man who had finally run out of lies. Outside, the neighborhood began to stir. A large industrial moving truck idled at the curb, its engine rumbling like a warning. Jessica walked out to the porch, clutching a mountain of designer luggage, her eyes red and swollen. I watched through the window as she moved slowly, her movements sluggish and weighted, as if she were carrying the physical mass of her own hubris. Neighbors peered through their curtains, whispering as they saw the real estate royalty, reduced to common migrants on a Sunday morning. It was a sight of total, uncompromising collapse. I thought about the photograph taped inside the kitchen cabinet, that small, faded piece of evidence that had been the silent witness to my son's long, slow descent into moral bankruptcy. "Take the picture from the cabinet," I said, my voice cutting through David's weeping. "The one in the kitchen. Keep it. It's the only honest thing you have left." He didn't look up, only gripped the envelope Linda had left for him, his fingers white and shaking. I walked out of the house one last time, leaving the front door wide open. I didn't look back at the grand foyer or the marble floors. I had already decided what this place would become. Months later, the Elmwood Drive estate had undergone a total metamorphosis. The lush private hedges were gone, replaced by a welcoming open garden. The sign above the gate no longer spoke of luxury or exclusivity. It read, "The Miller Vocational Center. No trade is beneath dignity. Only ingratitude makes a person small." I had transformed the house of greed into a fountain of opportunity where young apprentices, the kind I used to be, could learn to work with their hands, build a future, and find the self-respect that David had so carelessly squandered. I stood in my new office, the room where David once kept his home gym, and I placed the old family photograph from the kitchen cabinet on my desk. Beside it lay a plaque with the core message of my life. I had learned that family justice doesn't come from a shout or a fist fight. It comes from the quiet, immovable refusal to let anyone define your value. I had been a man who had lost everything, only to discover that the fire was never in the house or the money. It was in the iron of my own character. If this story struck a chord with you, if you've felt the sting of betrayal, or if you've ever had to rebuild your dignity from the ashes, leave a comment below. Share this with someone who needs the strength to stand up, and subscribe to Dad's Ultimate Payback for more stories of quiet, unyielding survival. Remember, the true revenge is not in tearing your enemies down or wallowing in anger. It is in standing so tall, so far above the reach of those who once crushed you, that you can transform your deepest bitterness into a beacon of light for others. Dignity is the one thing they can never steal unless you hand it to them. I chose not to. Stand tall, keep your spirit unbreakable, and always remember, you are the author of your own redemption. True family justice never needs an audience. It only needs a heart that refuses to go cold.